So, matters of baby making. The Catholic Church and others have been criticized for having strong objections to technologies whose ostensible purpose is to provide children for infertile couples, in short, to produce new human lives. And you often find the objection, well, isn't that pro-life? The history of the public policy debate on reproductive technologies, particularly at the federal level, though, dramatizes that this is only a superficial reality, because throughout the public policy debate, these technologies have been very closely associated with the destruction of developing human life, especially its destruction for research purposes. That association has now reached its high point, or morally, I would think, its absolute low point, in the current proposals we have now for human cloning, in which something that was once cited as a reproductive technology is sought solely in order to create human embryos in order to destroy them for research. In other words, a reproductive technology in which the only crime you can commit is to try to use them to reproduce. So this is a very odd situation. I want to review how we got there and what the antecedents to all this are. And then I want to correct the law professor on a matter of law regarding the cloning bills. But the lawyers at my shop always accuse me of doing that. So it's always fun. If you don't have a PhD, you have to play whatever you can get. Well, our tale begins in 1978 with the birth of baby Louise Brown in England, the first live birth from human in vitro fertilization. The first, as many call it, the first test tube baby to be born alive. And like Dolly the sheep, of course, Louise Brown her birth was preceded by the discarding and destruction of many, many dozens of embryos that did not make it to that point. IVF then, like cloning now, is a very inefficient and wasteful process. And there had to be a lot of research on embryos that no one had any intention of bringing to birth in order to get to that one live birth and the ones that followed. Interestingly enough, though, the immediate reaction of our own Department of Health, Education, and Welfare here in the United States was to name an ethics advisory board to discuss possible federal funding of research on human in vitro fertilization and IVF-produced embryos. And that was because when an earlier national commission in 1975 had set federal standards for fetal research, they had set aside the situation of the IVF embryo, the out-of-body embryo, not knowing yet whether it was really possible to do in humans, and said any research involving that in humans could not be, that research could not be funded unless there was first a thorough review by an ethics advisory board, which would have to find that doing that was, quote, ethically acceptable. Now, this board in 1979 did rule that some research using IVF embryos was ethically acceptable, and then they were kind of coy and said, now by ethically acceptable we mean that it would be, quote, ethically defensible, but still legitimately controverted. Sort of ambivalent endorsement. It reminds me of my favorite New Yorker cartoon where a lot of somewhat sleazy-looking businessmen are sitting around a conference table, and the guy at the head of the table is saying, now what we would be doing is wrong, but that doesn't make it indefensible. The board was ambivalent, and it declined to make any actual recommendation on whether to use federal funds for this research. And given that ambivalence, and a wave of public protest, partly organized by the silent Catholic Church, I should say, a wave of public protest, tens upon thousands of letters by American citizens to the Carter administration against funding embryo research. The Carter administration decided not to pursue that research. And while the issue has been revived at various times since, in later administrations, there was a big revived debate in 1988 where it really looked like Congress was going to fund this. What has been called the de facto moratorium on funding research on embryos continued into the Clinton administration. But in 1993, a new president, having reached the White House, who had a more seen as having a more negative attitude toward claims by unborn life, proponents of embryo research in Congress slipped one sentence into a reauthorization bill for the National Institutes of Health that rescinded the federal regulation requiring thorough review by an ethics advisory board to get any funding for embryo research involving in vitro fertilization. That same bill actually set new guidelines for federal funding of fetal tissue research and abortions. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of pro-life groups were really focused on that and trying to fight what Congress was trying to do on that. Fought it unsuccessfully because we have funding for transplant research using fetal tissue for abortions now under certain circumstances. But this one line was not able to get a lot of attention. I think actually I'm the only person in Washington who was trying to cry about it and nobody paid attention. So it wasn't the Catholic Church, but there was only this one guy, a staffer who's not a PhD. This left the NIH free to appoint a human embryo research panel to discuss funding of all kinds of embryo research with not even a pretense of balanced viewpoints. If you appoint an ethics advisory board, it's under the Administrative Procedure Act, and you have to do certain things in terms of publicity of deliberations and balanced viewpoints and so on. Those are all in the federal law. If you're just naming an advisory panel within NIH, you don't have some of those strictures. And so they were free to name a panel whose chairman announced at the first meeting in 1994 that the panel's sole purpose was to recommend which experiments involving the destruction of embryos would receive federal funding, not to decide whether or not it would be done. And in fact, the chairman, Stephen Mueller of Johns Hopkins, invited any panel member who had accidentally been appointed, who held a view against embryo research, to leave and not come back. I later said during public comment to this panel that the panel seemed a bit biased. And I was attacked for that, saying that in the press. Not surprisingly, the panel ended up recommending a broad array of experiments involving destruction of human embryos, including those produced by cloning and parthenogenesis, as well as by IVF, even though the use of those technologies in humans was still highly speculative. The panel included in its recommendations for the first time, I think in federal history, a recommendation that the government consider funding research that required the creation of embryos solely for the purpose of research that would destroy them. That was a new kind of thing. It was clearly one of the most controversial things among the panel members themselves. Patricia King of Georgetown, for example, very much pro-choice advocate, actually filed an additional statement saying how concerned she was about this idea of creating life just to destroy it. And is that an extra step towards treating life as a mere means instead of an end in itself? In making that recommendation, the panel got overconfident. There was enormous controversy over the idea. The Washington Post editorialized, quote, "The creation of human embryos specifically for research that will destroy them is unconscionable." The Chicago Sun-Times here called it grotesque at best. And President Clinton, who has been both praised and blamed for always having his finger on the pulse beat of public opinion, decided to set that recommendation aside and to recommend funding only research involving what have now become known as the spare embryos left over from in vitro fertilization clinics and from infertile couples' efforts to reproduce. The following year, before the Clinton plan could be implemented, Congress ended up banning federal funding for research on spare embryos as well, through an appropriations rider which remains in law today, known as the Dickey Amendment, after its prime sponsor, Congressman J. Dickey of Arkansas. 1997 then brought an entire new angle to the debate with the birth of Dolly the sheep, the first cloned sheep. Again, her birth was preceded by the unsuccessul efforts led to well between 200 and 300 fellow cloned sheep. And that led to an inconclusive skirmish in Congress over the prospect of human cloning. Reactions to Dolly were very interesting. I mean, people didn't know quite whether, is this just another extension of biological control over animals going to lead to something good, or is it a harbinger of something terrible in people? One person called me up and said, "Do you realize what this means? They're going to be able to make flocks of sheep that all look alike." But of course that wasn't, it's important to remember though, what the reason was for cloning Dolly the sheep. It was obviously not due to the lack of sheep. Cloning in the field of animal husbandry was seen as the gateway technology to making genetic engineering of sheep work. In other words, using genetic modification to work new genes, new traits into sheep or other animals. It's an incredibly inefficient and wasteful process. It may work 1% of the time or something a lot less. The idea was that if you ever got that to work and were able to make, you know, the sheep that produces twice as much wool, or the sheep that produces, you know, that'll cut its own lamb chops, no fat left, you know. If you wanted to produce superior sheep, you needed a technology that could then replicate that advance indefinitely, or you couldn't make it commercially viable. So cloning was not so much in order to have more sheep, it was in order to replicate the improved sheep that you could make by new genetic technologies, which I'll refer back to when we get to humans as something particularly ominous when you cross it over. The inconclusiveness in Congress was that, as we have very much now, we had two different approaches. One of them recommended by President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission, and then proposed by the administration itself, and taken up by Senator Feinstein and others, which tried to place at least a moratorium on trying to use this technology, sometimes known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. This is the technology that was used to make Dolly the sheep. To put a moratorium on trying to use that to make a live-born baby, largely based on the argument that this is such a dangerous technology, there would be so much harm from it in terms of miscarriages and stillbirths and defects among those who were born. And that argument continues to this day. The other bill introduced by Senators Bond and Frist would have actually banned the use of this technology to make human embryos for any purpose. And in the end, neither bill had enough support in the U.S. Senate to move forward. But in December of '98, the embryo research debate came back in full force, this time in the context of what's now become known as stem cell research. There were announcements in November of that year that researchers had made some advances in being able to grow embryonic stem cells in the lab. And you shouldn't be afraid of the word stem cells in terms of it being particularly complicated. Stem cells are relatively unspecialized cells that can do two things. They can, when they divide, they can make another stem cell that's just like itself, or they can make a cell that is more specialized. You have stem cells all throughout your body. If you've ever given blood, and the technician said, rest up a little bit until your blood cell count is up to speed after donating. You had one kind of blood stem cell in your bone marrow that was making all the different kinds of blood cells, red blood cells and white blood cells and so on, that you need. There's just one kind of blood stem cell that can make all the different cells. People felt that embryonic stem cells would be particularly versatile, that one embryonic stem cell might be capable of, down the road, producing all of the more than 200 different kinds of cells and tissues in the body, be used for transplants and degenerative diseases, and cure almost everything, in the words of some of its more enthusiastic proponents. And supporters in Congress immediately began predicting that this would be the holy grail, if you will, for curing a broad variety of diseases. And they did this with a good deal of political cleverness, because back at the end of 1994, when the Human Embryo Research Panel was trying to promote the idea of funding embryo research, embryonic stem cells had been part of the menu that they were trying to put forward. But as political opposition to the idea grew, they started talking about narrowing their agenda and getting people used to the idea of embryo research by pursuing a particular kind that you could make a particularly plausible case would be useful for curing diseases, and then bring in the rest as people got used to the idea more and more. And politically, in particular, the idea was you got to stop having just the research people come forward and promote this, because general run of people, they don't have anything against researchers, but they don't, the research community as a whole does not have a tremendous amount of political clout. But they wanted to get all the patient groups on their side. They wanted to convince the diabetes, Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, the Spinal Cord Injury Association, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and all these other groups doing their lobbying work for them, convincing them that this was going to be the solution to all their problems. And by end of 1998, they had some little advances in growing these cells in the lab, and they decided they could make these claims. And they could push this on a whole new front with a far broader political coalition. So this took off, as you know, over the next 2 years as an enormous debate in which scientific progress was posed against religion and benighted pro-lifers and so on. The December '98 hearing, though, actually reviewed 3 different ways to get embryonic stem cells. And the list is worth reviewing because it itself displayed a kind of slippery slope in closer and closer involvement in activities showing disregard for human life. One was our old friend, fetal tissue, because it turned out there are cells in the reproductive tracts of the unborn child at about 8 weeks of gestation that remain less specialized than the rest of the fetal cells, embryonic germ cells. And you could get those tissue after an abortion. You could also get them after a miscarriage, but the researchers weren't that interested in that and thought it wouldn't be as useful. John Gearhart at Johns Hopkins University was a pioneer in doing that, embryonic germ cells from fetal tissue. And that's already legal. That was already legal for funding because it comes under fetal tissue. Secondly, you could harvest these cells by taking so-called spare embryos from in vitro fertilization clinics, growing them to the blastocyst stage, about a little under a week old, and then harvesting these cells, destroying the embryo. James Thompson of University of Wisconsin was pushing for that. And that was really the primary focus of these ensuing 2 years of debate. And third, this was a little-known researcher from Massachusetts, Michael West, who came forward and said, look, those other 2 possibilities are all okay, but they're going to lead you to incompatible transplants. You're going to end up producing cells that when you try to put them into a patient would still be rejected as foreign tissue. What you need to do is tailor-make the embryos by cloning. Take a body cell from the patient you want to treat, take the nucleus out, put that into an egg whose nucleus you've taken out, and then stimulate that, and you can produce embryonic development. Then you kill that embryo for exact genetically matched cells for each patient. Now that allegedly would solve the problem of tissue rejection. It would also make the ongoing creation and destruction of countless human embryos into an integral part of medical practice in the future for each individual patient who needs help. So we would be going far beyond any debates about existing cell lines or what number of cell lines. You would need a new matched cell line for each individual patient. But for that time, it was, and I don't say this cynically, because later history has borne me out. The members of Congress who wanted to pursue this felt it was politically wise to express misgivings about cloning and creating embryos for research. Because once they felt the time was right, they had no hesitation at all in then turning over and endorsing that as well. But they said, oh no, this is just going to be these spare embryos, they're going to be discarded anyway, nobody wants them. They were originally created for this good cause of human reproduction, and now nobody knows what to do with them. And so we should make some good out of a bad situation and cure some diseases. Now, all of those claims were highly questionable on factual grounds. These were not embryos that were going to be discarded anyway. These were embryos who parents did not have a current use for because they were in the process of taking just a few embryos and trying to implant those to make a baby, and they would go back. They'd be going back to these if they needed to. But the Clinton administration's guidelines that ultimately came out said that if they're in the freezer, you can go to the couple, and at the same time that you're presenting them with all the other options for dealing with these embryos, whether to start another child or to donate to another couple or to discard, you can put in the added option, donate for federally funded research to get their stem cells. It was not a case where people decided to discard first and then, only then would they be asked, oh, would you rather do this instead? There was also a claim that these embryos were all routinely discarded anyway. But you thought about it couldn't be true because simultaneously it was claimed there were 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 in the freezers and nobody knows what to do with them. Well, if they're routinely discarded, what are they still doing in the freezers? And the answer is that both the clinics and many of the infertile couples are very queasy about doing something so final as simply discarding them. The reason they have been indefinitely in the freezers is that nobody does know what to do with them, but they can't bring themselves to do something so final as discard them as though they were yesterday's garbage. In fact, when the Bioethics Advisory Commission did a study of practice in these clinics, they found that a pretty high percentage of the clinics they surveyed had never discarded a single embryo once it was frozen. They couldn't quite bring themselves to do it. They did have some sense that this is something more than just research material, you know, these test tube babies, if you want to call them. But whatever the truth of those factual claims, Congress did proceed to work up a lot of support for this, notwithstanding some serious problems. Of course, there's the moral problem, but I want to emphasize that the moral problem was not, at least potentially, only among those of us who would call the early embryo a person. One of the most startling things, you look back at this whole history, the 1979 Ethics Advisory Board, the Human Embryo Research Panel in 1994, the Bioethics Advisory Commission, all of these bodies said that the embryo was a developing form of human life that deserved respect. They would then proceed to say, but there's cures in them, they're hills, so we're going to override the respect in favor of the therapeutic promise. But the Bioethics Advisory Commission said something interesting. They said because these embryos deserve respect as human life, it would be unethical, it would be unjustifiable to use them for stem cell research if there were morally less problematic ways to advance the research. And this, of course, was an invitation to those of us who didn't want to be forced to fund embryo research to highlight what have now become very startling advances in adult stem cell research and other alternatives that are far further along in actually treating and curing patients than anything using embryonic stem cells. So just to use a rough comparison, I can't go into the details, but it's already been mentioned that the one biggest success in the last 20 years in gene therapy was in helping to cure severe combined immune deficiency, bubble boy syndrome. Some children have actually been completely, apparently, cured of this condition. And the way they were cured was by supplying the missing gene that they needed for a healthy immune system to their own adult stem cells, and then putting those back into their bodies. And of course, those cells produced a whole new blood system that had the right gene in it. Stem cells from bone marrow and umbilical cord have cured many, many tens of thousands of patients, or helped in their treatment from cancer and leukemia. We now have adult stem cell research that is being used to bring sight to people who had corneal damage. We have clinical trials in use of bone marrow stem cells to help people repair damaged hearts after heart attacks. We even have adult islet cell transplants that have seemingly permanently reversed juvenile diabetes in a couple of dozen people now, and there are more clinical trials in testing that protocol that are likely to move toward real clinical use. Meanwhile, the overview of the New York Times did of embryonic stem cell research so far was that they had never yet been used in a human being, and that after 20 years of concentrated work on mouse embryonic stem cells, they have yet to cure a single mouse. people have begun to talk about false hopes and exaggeration and hype in the context of embryonic stem cell research. My personal belief is that part of the hype was due to the fact that some of the researchers and some of those in NIH who were in this campaign were less interested in how reliable these predictions of cures were and more interested in getting that political wedge for opening up the entire field of embryo research that they were very interested in pursuing. Now, that debate on stem cell research has been at least paused or interrupted by President Bush's decision about using existing stem cell lines, with everyone waiting to see how that works out. I'm not going to comment on that at any length here. I just want to get back to cloning to conclude, because this has now been proposed as the next step you need to take in order to make embryonic stem cell research work, in order to get these genetically matched tissues. Ironically, there are a lot of scientific barriers to the clinical use of embryonic stem cells, and the need for an exact genetic match is probably not even one of them, because we're finding with umbilical cord blood transplants, for example, that the earlier in development the cells are, the less they need an exact genetic match, the less immune reaction they produce. But the cloning controversy, as has now been mentioned a couple of times, has been revived by alleged success, again by Michael West, who's back with us, in now producing human embryos by cloning. There's the Brown-backed Landrieu bill, which simply bans the use of the cloning procedure to make human embryos. And there are actually two different competing bills that they're essentially the same: Feinstein bill and the Harkin bill. Now, here's where I want to utter a little cavil at Jerry Bradley. There was a Greenwood bill in the House that actually would have banned the use of the cloning procedure with the intent of transplanting that embryo to a uterus. That's not what either one of these bills does. They're far more straightforward. Actually, there were a lot of complaints about that, even from the biotechnology industry, because they pointed out, well, you ban the use of this procedure with some purpose. How are you going to regulate that? What you're going to end up doing is having a chilling effect on any use of the technology, because you're going to have to be always looking over people's shoulders to see why they did it, and how are you ever going to be able to tell what their purpose was in doing that. So the Feinstein and Harkin bills don't ban the use of the cloning procedure at all, for any purpose. They ban an entirely distinct procedure known as embryo transfer. They simply say the one thing you cannot do with a cloned embryo is put it in a womb to let it survive. You can make them all you want. You don't even have to tell anybody why you're making them. The only thing you cannot do, the only crime, is to do what it's natural for embryos to do, basically, which is to go in a womb and grow up. You actually have government defining a class of human embryos. It is a federal crime not to destroy. Okay? Because the one thing you're banning is putting them in a womb to let them live another day later. You are forced. You can make them all you want, but then the government will, stand over your shoulder and say you must throw them away and destroy them for research. Now, that's a pretty ineffectual way to ban cloning, as a lot of people have pointed out, because once you have these farms of thousands of embryos supposedly for research, and are able to produce viable embryos, which is a process that will probably take more months of refining, the process of a woman of childbearing age actually walking in and putting one of these embryos in her womb is sort of the easy part. That takes seconds. And once she's done it, what are you going to do? How are you going to enforce the ban? Put her in prison for 10 years? That's the penalty. Put her in prison for 10 years for being pregnant? Force her to have an abortion? I don't think so. This is, in order to protect research cloning, whose therapeutic benefits remain completely speculative, you would actually create a ban on cloning that doesn't effectively ban anything at all, even its use for reproduction. I'm supposed to be talking about prospective, but I don't have much time for that. So, I think we're standing at a crossroads here in the technology of human cloning. Let's say that the Congress allows so-called therapeutic cloning of embryos for research. I think we can foretell what that will mean for humans from what's being done now in animal models. And two things are being done in animal models. One is that we are seeing on the front page of US News and World Report, now that they've cloned cats, that this is the gateway technology for making designer pets. Just as the cloning of Dolly the sheep was the gateway technology for making genetically engineered sheep feasible. It is the technology that you need if you really want to make genetic engineering of the superior human work. Because once you get that to work, you want to be able to make more of it. So we're talking about a world in which we have designer children, perhaps as new status symbols for the elite. But we have, among some of the proponents of this, like Lee Silver of Princeton, the prediction that the elite who have the money and the resources and the will to have these superior children will accumulate these improvements over time to the point where the elite are no longer capable of effectively reproducing with the rest of us. In other words, you will have two species, the genetic haves and the genetic have-nots. And Lee Silver foresees this, and he thinks that's a pretty good idea. We're already well along the way then to Brave New World, the deltas and the epsilons, the caste system. The other thing that has been, that is a current animal model for therapeutic cloning, oddly enough, even though all the talk is about embryos, the only current claim for successful animal model using cloning of animal embryos is a recent experiment by Michael West people in which the embryo was cloned but then was grown to the fetal stage in order to get developed kidney cells to transplant into a cow. I'm sitting here and thinking a few weeks ago, well, if you can't put it in a uterus, if the only thing that would be illegal is putting this embryo in a uterus, how's that going to work? And the next day, researchers in California were announcing their progress in making the artificial womb. Oh, well, that's not a uterus. Problem solved. I don't think that there isn't any logic to this agenda that stops at the embryo if you can maintain the embryo outside the womb, outside a uterus, to a later stage where you can get more useful cells and tissues or complete organs. So you really do have, without having to pass any new legislation at all, you have complete allowance under the Feinstein-Parkin bills for growing embryos as far as you can get them to the fetal stage for spare parts. The other path is if we manage to ban cloning. And I think that'll give us some breathing space. We could begin to sit back and ask, how did we get to the brink of accepting a reproductive technology that was so dehumanizing that the only thing we thought was good to do with it was to make embryos to kill? How did we get to the point where reproductive technology can be used for anything at all except reproduction? And if we began to think back to the dehumanizing aspects of making human beings to specification in the laboratory, maybe we would begin to look back at IVF and our ideas about reproduction and where this began in terms of the temptations to see laboratory-made humans as somehow less human as a kind of research material. And in an ideal world, we would begin to raise those questions to such an extent and so compellingly that even Catholics would begin to take another look at that issue.
Let's take 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you for your presentation. It's made a lot clearer in my mind. However, science does not have any bars of court. Science has no nationality. Whatever laws we enact or don't enact, how is this going to stop science in another country or help our cause from what we're
I have a quick answer to that and a slightly less flippant answer. My quick answer is that even as we speak, actually on February 26th, the Bush administration presented testimony at a hearing of the United Nations, which is considering the idea of an international covenant to ban reproductive human cloning. And the administration made, I thought, an excellent case on why, if you want to ban cloning, you should do it across the board. In other words, they are, having endorsed the Brownback approach to this, they are asking other countries, some of whom have already passed strong bans on cloning, some of our own states in the United States have, asking to consider banning the use of this technology to make human embryos in the laboratory at all. And I think, you know, any international agreement like that, of course, will still always have loopholes. I don't think that the law prevents, I mean, it doesn't prevent anything, right? It makes it less common. It means that you can get a prosecutor to prosecute it if people go ahead and do it. It'll greatly reduce it. It's a statement by society of what is acceptable and normative behavior, and I think will greatly reduce the number of people who do it. I don't think the prestigious academic researchers are the people who want federal funding, or the people who are in companies that rely on the public trust are going to do it. People have said to me, well, if you pass a law, it'll just drive it underground, and my answer is that's what all laws do. But I think there is opportunity here for international action. In fact, when Great Britain became the first nation to formally legalize and license and begin licensing the idea of therapeutic cloning, cloning human embryos for research, that decision was actually denounced by a majority vote of the European Parliament. Most of Europe is very concerned about this and doesn't think that you should just move right into experimental cloning in humans. And the people who are most strongly pressing for that parliamentary resolution condemning what the British did were Green Party liberals, our sometime allies on the political left, who are very concerned about the misuse of genetic and other technologies. And there's beginning to be some loose alliance in this country, which was mentioned earlier, between right and left on this that we can build upon. So I don't think it would eliminate all the practice, but I think it could go a long way. Yeah, wait a minute.
A clarification, are these bills that are up there, are they for the federal funding of, or the actual?
No, the debate on cloning now really is about the legal status of the procedure. The current situation on federal funding is that the Dickey Amendment is still there, and research involving destruction of human embryos in the lab cannot receive federal funds. And the only exception to that, if you want to call it an exception, is that there is some federal funding available for using embryonic stem cell lines that already exist because the embryos were destroyed for those stem cells before last August 9th, when President Bush made his speech saying only if they were destroyed before the moment when I'm speaking. And so there's no new research that can be done with federal funds that would involve destroying embryos, whether by IVF or cloning. What we're talking about now is the legal status of these procedures. And the difference is that they have the same penalties. The penalties are for doing different things.
One more.
You mentioned that there have been methods of reversing diseases like juvenile diabetes that have not involved the use of embryos. Who exactly is doing that? I mean, what are methods of supporting those not so morally questionable?
Yeah. My really short answer is to refer you to a website which keeps track of these things as they emerge, which is www.stemcellresearch. That's like one word, stemcellresearch.org, which is an organization of scientists and others who favor stem cell research, but not any that would require destroying embryos. The juvenile diabetes work was put forward by researchers in Alberta, Canada. It's called the Edmonton Protocol because it was developed by researchers in Edmonton, Alberta. But it's now being tried in several clinical sites around the United States, and I think the NIH has a solicitation on its website asking people to volunteer for this. What's new about it is that it uses adult islet cells, pancreatic islet cells. There are two variations on past efforts. One is they take the cells for each transplant from 2 cadavers instead of 1 to increase the volume of cells, and the other is a new immunosuppressive regimen that keeps the tissue from being rejected. And I think there are 14 people in the Edmonton clinical trials alone who have simply been able to throw away their insulin needles and now seem to be cured of diabetes. Now, that's not the only clinically promising treatment. There are problems to be solved in all of them, but there are, several promising avenues like that that are all way ahead of embryonic stem cells in terms of curing diabetes.
Thanks very much.